Bonjour à tous, je suis très content de vous retrouver aujourd'hui. J'espère que vous allez très très bien. Et je suis encore plus content de vous retrouver aujourd'hui. Alors c'est une toute petite intro, vous inquiétez pas, ça va durer à peine une minute. Mais voilà, je voulais vous présenter un peu ce qui va suivre. Et donc effectivement, quand j'ai créé ma chaîne, une des raisons pour laquelle je l'ai créée, c'était entre autres de pouvoir en arriver à un moment à pouvoir avoir l'occasion de discuter avec des créateurs, étant un passionné de comics. Et du coup, voilà, j'avais vraiment cette envie de pouvoir échanger avec des gens de l'industrie, vraiment des créateurs, que ce soit des auteurs, des artistes, pourquoi pas même des éditeurs ou autres. Et il s'avère que voilà, comme vous le savez, vu que vous avez vu le titre de la vidéo et que vous la regardez, c'est arrivé. Donc voilà, c'est la première interview sur la chaîne. J'ai eu la chance de recevoir un de mes auteurs actuels favoris, en l'occurrence Ramvi, qui est, pour ceux qui connaîtraient moins, celui qui a écrit entre autres Laila Starr, les nombreuses morts, je crois que c'est toutes les morts de Laila Starr en français, The Many Deaths of Laila Starr, qui en ce moment écrit une mini-série Aquaman Andromeda, qui est l'auteur en ce moment de Venom pour Marvel, de Carnage aussi pour Marvel, de Swamp Thing pour Black Label du coup DC Comics, qui va être très prochainement l'auteur d'un des titres les plus emblématiques des comics américains, c'est-à-dire Détective Comics, donc le comics sur Batman. Il y a Batman et Détective Comics. Batman va être repris par Chip Zdarsky et Détective Comics par Ramvi. Et donc voilà, alors par contre, d'avance, je vous le dis, je suis bilingue à l'écrit, ce qui n'est pas du tout le cas à l'oral, dans le sens où j'ai un accent absolument pourri. Mais déjà, vous inquiétez pas, tout est sous-titré, hein, je précise tout de suite. Toute la discussion est évidemment sous-titrée. Mais voilà, je vous demande d'être indulgent vis-à-vis de mon anglais absolument exécrable, absolument honteux, j'ai envie de dire, totalement honteux même. Mais voilà, l'important c'est que lui m'ait compris. Ce sont les réponses, c'est ce qu'a à dire un auteur avec autant de talent. Et voilà, donc je ne vous en voudrais pas de vous marrer parce que je le fais moi-même devant la médiocrité de mon oral à l'anglais. Mais voilà, j'espère au moins, en tout cas, surtout, que vous apprécierez les réponses de mon invité. J'espère que, voilà, n'hésitez pas à partager la vidéo parce que c'est pas un truc que je demande vraiment habituellement, mais voilà, si ça fonctionne, ça permettra d'en avoir d'autres. Et c'est quelque chose dont j'ai vraiment envie, donc voilà, si ça vous intéresse, surtout qu'en plus, voilà, pour les prochaines, je vous demanderai certainement à vous aussi de poser des questions, si vous voulez, de me faire parvenir des questions que je puisse poser du coup aux différents invités. Mais voilà, en tout cas, je ne continue pas plus longtemps et je vous laisse avec le mois du passé et mon extraordinaire invité du coup, Ramvi. Et voilà, j'espère que vous apprécierez. Et sur ce, je vous souhaite une bonne écoute et j'espère que tout va toujours très bien pour vous. Et je vous dis au revoir et je vous laisse avec la vidéo. Voilà. So, Ramvi, thanks a lot once again for accepting the invitation on my little French YouTube channel. I'm really happy to have you. First, how are you?
Doing all right. Recovering from a little bit of tonsillitis that my 1-year-old son passed on to me, but otherwise doing okay.
Okay, hope he's fine. No.
Yeah, he is fine. He was fine.
Okay.
He was fine. Like a few days later, just passed it on to me, and now I have the adult version of it. So,
have to deal with it. And I think you're in a time where you have a lot of work with all the books you are releasing right now.
Mm-hmm.
It must be very difficult with being sick. But so I want to talk first about yourself, because we'll discuss that later, but I think there are things that are very important in your work. Like, so I know you grew up in India.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell me a little more about that? Until what age did you live there? Or
Yeah, I grew up in India until I was about 20-ish.
Okay.
I moved to the States around that age to study chemical engineering. I grew up in a working class, middle class home. My father was a chemical engineer himself, and my mother worked in a bank. I used to read a lot. My father kind of encouraged me to read quite a bit. So I kind of grew up as this nerdy kid who loved stories and loved writing. And I had a few writers in my extended family. My granduncle was a person who wrote stories in Tamil, in which is a regional language in India. And my granduncle, although he didn't write stories, he was very famous for being a very colorful personality and a liar and a magician and whatnot. So I was surrounded by storytellers when I was a kid.
Okay, but you didn't have comics.
I did. I had Indian comics, and I had some. India had a long tradition of reprinting European comics, so characters like Phantom, Mandrake, and Flash Gordon.
Yeah.
And then I had access to a lot of European comics as a kid growing up as well. I had access to Tintin. I had access to Asterix the Gaul, and so I read those. And then I had access to newsprints. So I had Spider-Man in the Sunday newspapers, and I had I'm forgetting the name now. And then as a teenager, I read a lot of Archie comics as a teenager as well. So I had access to comics. It wasn't that I didn't. It's just I didn't have access to a lot of Marvel DC stuff.
Yeah, that's it. Because I heard you talk about the fact that you began to discover those characters mostly with the animated series.
Yeah, I mean, I think two of the big animated series for me when I was growing up were Spider-Man and the Batman animated series.
Of course.
And both of those were amazing. I also really loved, for some reason, like this one sticks with me. There's an animated series called Phantom 2040. Which was animated, I think, by the same guys who did Aeon Flux.
Okay.
So that one was quite amazing as well. I grew up with a lot of cartoons, animations. I loved watching them. And then it was only after I had moved to the States that I started reading sort of contemporary American comics.
Mostly Vertigo, I think.
Yeah, a friend of mine gifted volume 1 of Sandman to me. And that's what kind of brought me into the mainstream comics through Vertigo, if you will.
And how did you start wanting to work in that industry? I think your first one was a self-published called Black Mamba.
Yeah. I didn't really ever overtly want to work in the industry per se. I just wanted to tell stories.
Okay.
And I was already writing stories when I was a teenager, and I had a few things published here and there. And then when I quit chemical engineering in 2013, and I decided to take up writing quite seriously. And it just so happened that one of my friends in India noticed, my cousin actually noticed, that my writing style was quite visual. I depended on a lot of conjuring, a lot of imagery when I was writing. And he said, you should try writing graphic novels and comics. So I wrote a few comics back in India that had become quite successful. I wrote a series called Agori in India, which became quite well known. And then I moved to the UK to study writing in 2014. And it was at the end of that course that I put Black Mamba together and self-published it. So Black Mamba is technically my first sort of internationally published, but also like first independent comic that I created from scratch, if you will. Yeah.
And it's the one that made the editors hear about you.
Yeah, I mean, I had an opportunity to send it to a bunch of editors. I was able to give it to Jamie Rich, who was at Vertigo at the time. I was able to pass it on to Shelley Bond, who had been a Vertigo editor at the time. I sent it to a whole bunch of editors, people at Boom and Dark Horse as well. And it opened a few doors for me. I think it was the first book I sent to Eric Stevenson at Image as well.
Okay.
And the next year after I had released Black Mamba was when I had my first Image book. So I'd like to think that that's what led to the Image book happening.
Yeah, of course. So I've read a lot of your work. What was the first big work after Black Mamba?
I think the first big work after Black Mamba was Paradiso.
I love it.
I also, at the time, I was already working on an Action Lab comic called Brigands and Ruin of Thieves as well.
Love it too.
So that one was coming out around the same time as Paradiso was. And then I think the next significant work after that was 2018 when I did my first DC short story in Batman Secret Files.
Yeah, Batman Secret Files. I have to ask, Paradiso, I think it's too late. We won't have a follow-up.
I don't think, I mean, at this point, I think it probably makes more sense for me to just go do a new Image book than continue.
Yeah, I can totally understand. But I love that book. It's really fantastic. If you haven't read it, for those listening, really Paradiso is a great book with great art. I love that world.
Thank you.
And same for Sea of Brigand and Sea of Brigand. I'm not big into fantasy, but that's that again. You still manage to bring your thing to a universe, and it brings me. We'll go forward in time. I want to talk about your books that people can find here in France.
Yeah,
and one of them, for example, is this one.
Yeah,
a beautiful edition. This Savage Shores, iComics, Sinarwo. It's a great book. Can you talk a little about it, please? How did you come to write that book?
I think that was around 2018. I was talking to Vault at the time, and they had asked me for a bunch of pitches. And this is always a funny story. I sent them 2 pitches that I thought were pretty decent. And then I was like, I need to add a third one. And I'd been working on the idea of a vampire story, but talking about India and colonialism and all of that. And I said, no one's going to want to publish a vampire story in 2019, whatever, because I don't know. I felt like vampires were overdone at the time.
Man, I'm not big into vampires at all. There are 2 people who managed to make me really care about a vampire story. And I saw you interact today with the other one. It's you and Rodney Barnes with Philadelphia. Those are the 2 vampires books I discovered nearly at the same time that I love.
Yeah, Rodney's amazing. I do love a lot of his work as well. Yeah. So yeah, I sent them that pitch, and as I have learned, it always happens now. They were like, yeah, that one. We want that one. I said, okay, cool. And then, lo and behold, a year later, we had these Savage Shores. I think the idea had originally come to me when I was researching Indian mythology and just thought to myself, Rakshasas have so much in common with vampires in that they also come out at night. They attack unsuspecting travelers and drink their blood. And a lot of cultures have this obsession with blood-consuming monsters, if you will. So I decided to look up when the first mention of a vampire was in European literature. And turns out that the Indian Rakshas is about 200 years older than the first mention of a vampire in European literature. And that kind of got my brain thinking about, what if a vampire came to India and realized, here's a thing that has been alive a lot longer than me,
It's funny because I just realized already in Paradiso, you had something very close to
vampires. Yeah.
So it's funny. It's something that works in mind.
Yeah, it's been in my mind. I mean, if you think about it, in Paradiso, that was a reinterpretation of vampires as a part of the technology, and with these Savage Shores, it was almost framing the vampire as a reinterpretation of the original Rakshas myth, if you will.
Yeah.
So yeah. I think my brain tends to work like that. It tends to be obsessed about things, and I keep exploring them over and over in my work until I get bored of them. So
about the Savage Shores, did you meet the artist Sumit Kumar?
Yeah, so Sumit had been part of the Indian comic scene for quite a long time before I got into comics even. He had produced, I think, 2 or 3 books or 2 or 3 stories back in India. And yeah, I was just struck by his work when I had started looking at things there. And I was quite surprised to find out that he was, some 24, 25 at the time.
Okay.
And he was already producing tremendous work.
Yeah.
So we met, I talked to him. He actually was supposed to be creating Brigands with me when that first started out, but he couldn't because he had joined a course in animation in India, I think. And once he was finished with that course, he came back and he said, "Hey, I know we had talked about collaborating. So if you've got anything that you want to work on, let's talk." And it so happened that These Savage Shores was the thing we settled on.
Okay. And it's something I love about how you do things. You often work with Indian artists or even letterers or things like that. Is it something important for you?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I was talking about this with someone just a few days ago. I think 3 years ago, Aditya got nominated for an Eisner. And then last year, Anand Radhakrishnan won the Eisner for his work on Blue and Green, which is a book he did with me. And then this year, I'm nominated for multiple Eisner nominations as well.
Well done.
And it you have to understand, from my perspective, like that has never happened with Indian creators before. They have never. I think the only other person I know of at least Indian origin was I can't remember his name, but the creator who did the 5th Beatle graphic novel. But I believe, he's an Indian who's been living abroad for years. That's not to say that that's not the case with me, but it certainly felt like a moment where Indian creators had kind of at least broken through enough to make a mark on contemporary comics. And that was very important for me because I've always felt like Indian history, culture, and art have been tremendous, but they've been pigeonholed into a place where they exist as reproductions, paler reproductions of the colonial baggage that they carry. But it's only in more recent times that they've begun breaking out of that mold. And yet I felt like there's no drive to produce work that is accessible and understandable on an international stage outside of very specific kinds of Indian literature. And so, yeah, I wanted to do something with that, and I wanted to kind of make a statement, if you will, to say that, look, there are artists and writers and painters and creators from a part of the world that people assume things about, and yet here's work that can be both in that mold and also break that mold, if you will. So
yeah, completely. And on the same thing, there's also the content, the stories themselves. I find it so cool. We often talk about diversity in comics, things like that, and it's great to have different kinds of characters. But you really bring all that background to the stories themselves, a different voice, and it's something I find fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, to me, I think to me, at least conceptually or philosophically, that is the thing that diversity in any kind of literature is reaching for. Diversity doesn't end at changing the color or gender or race of a character. That is very important, but it shouldn't end there. If anything, I'm saying it needs to go whole hog, in that if you're going to have an Indian Superman at some point, then you can't just say he's Indian and then have him be Superman. No, you have to ask the question, how does that character change because they're Indian? What does that background mean? What does that bring to the story? Because the moment you do that, I think you bring a diversity to storytelling, which I think is fundamentally more important. Because in the end, people love these iconic characters, but people love them because of their stories, not because of the costume or what they represent or the icons that they are. All of that happens through story. And I think, therefore, diversity in storytelling is fundamentally more important.
Yeah, totally agree. Totally agree. I want to talk about another book that I'm so happy to have, at least. This one, Laila Starr.
Yeah.
We're very lucky in France because we have it in an oversized.
Yeah. I was supposed to be in France today.
I know.
To talk about to be on a signing tour for that book. Unfortunately, it didn't happen. But
Monday, you were supposed to be at like 14 kilometers from me.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Well, I think we will do it a couple of months from now. So hopefully I will be 14 kilometers from you again.
No, I'll be there. Not 40 kilometers. So this one was released by Urban here, who are the one who also publish all the DC comic works.
Mm-hmm.
It's a fantastic book. It's just a fantastic book of a lot of success. I'm not the first one to tell you that. I know that's a story that you had for a very long time in yourself. Can you tell us a little more about that?
I don't know that I had the story for a very long time in myself. I know I had the concept for it. It existed in many different versions and in many different ways. There's been a very long tradition of Indian stories where gods have come down or are sent down or are forced by circumstances to come live among mortals. And there's always a humoristic bent to it. And so I kind of wanted to tell something that was in the tradition of that for a very long time. And then I knew that I had wanted to write a story about death at some point in time. In fact, I had wanted to write that a lot longer than anything else. But it had always been something that I felt like I was not equipped to do because I had not encountered or understood the idea or the concept enough in any way to be genuinely meaningful about it. And then the pandemic happened, and we were engulfed by the idea in some ways. And I think it was a confluence of all of that to a large extent that made this particular story possible.
Yeah. And how did you meet with Philippe Andrade, the artist of this book, who did a tremendous work? It's just incredible.
Yeah, Philippe is amazing.
Of course, I show visuals during the interview to show people because they have to see it.
Yeah. No, Philippe is amazing. His work is brilliant. And I actually didn't meet him before we started working on the book. It was Eric Harbour, who was our editor at Boom. He sent me samples of Philippe's work from his Instagram. And I was we had discussed multiple artists before then. And then we got to Philippe's work and I said, okay, this is the guy. We have to get this guy because I think there's so much life and innocence in Philippe's line work, which is it's very hard to do, to capture that kind of whimsical energy in the line work, which then translates to his characters. And of course, his storytelling is phenomenal as well. So it's just been a tremendous pleasure to work with him on the book.
I love what you said in an interview about his work being like a scene on a beach, always moving, but still very, very calm and very relaxing. Yeah. And I love that image. Yes, there's movement. There's
yes. I mean, even when people sit still, they're full of life, and that's what I meant by when Philippe's line work transmits that liveliness, even if it is a scene where people are sitting very still.
Yeah, and I think in your work, from what I've read, there's a lot about. I like to try to find some themes, and there's a lot about identity, about who we are, what makes us who we are, the world around us, and about death. And about death, there's a story I want to hear you say. So I listened when you were growing up. There was what you call a tower of silence.
Yeah.
Can you tell us more about that? Because I didn't know that.
Yeah,
don't know that.
I actually covered this in Black Mamba. India is actually home to, I think, one of two remaining Zoroastrian communities in the world. So in India, they're called Parsis, but essentially they're people who follow the religion of Zoroastrianism. And there's a Tower of Silence, which is part of their, death rites, if you will, as part of the religion, where they do open air burials, and that they leave the corpse, the body of the person that's passed away, in the Tower of Silence. And the idea is that nature will reclaim that body, and that birds and bacteria and whatnot will reclaim that body. And I grew up very close to one of these Towers of Silence in a suburb of Mumbai called Thane, which is now an independent city. But and it's all these little ways where you don't realize, but you already have a relationship with death. Like I didn't know anybody who had, gone to that tower, who had been, who had passed away and went to that tower.
But it was there.
But yes, it's very odd in that when I was a kid, my parents enrolled me in ping pong classes. Mm-hmm. So I used to go and play ping pong with a bunch of kids. It was a kind of a big warehouse with lots of tables, lots of 8 or 12 tables, lots of kids playing. And the moment you stepped outside the warehouse and you looked to the sky, the first thing you saw was this tower and just black birds circling this tower. It's very surrealist thing. A bunch of people playing ping pong, and then there's death in the sky.
I can get that. When I was growing up, I grew up in France, but I'm from Algeria. And just near the apartment where we were at my grandmother's place, there was what we call a minaret, which is that. So I was a little boy, and I could hear that those prayers every day. It was incredible with those songs, and it was really
and that's actually a very common experience in India. Obviously, Islam is the second largest religion in India, and even as an adult, when I went back to live in India, I went to the States, then I went back to live in India for about 3 or 4 years. The apartment that I lived in was right across from a mosque and a minaret. And the muezzin is what they're called, the prayers. They would start their prayers at 4 a.m. And sometimes it was annoying, like, I can imagine. Sleep. But also sometimes it's very intensely beautiful. At 4:30, everything is quiet, and all you're hearing is like this lonely voice of a prayer coming out of the mosque. And you realize that people who are really devoted to that ideology will go to the mosque at 4 a.m. And there is something. I'm not a religious person at all, but there's something intensely spiritual about that, and I quite enjoy it. Yeah.
Yeah, of course. I want to ask you, we're talking about your independent work, and there's something that I find interesting is how does it happen for a writer, for a creator, for a creator, when you come to be able to be published in another country? Is it something very complex? Do you have people to help you with those kind of things? How does things go?
I'm sure if I were to sort of poke into that, I would be able to have a say in it. But frankly, I think the book just goes to a translator and they translate. And only occasionally have I ever had questions from translators in terms of how do I translate this? What exactly do you mean? In most cases, I don't know what the book says when it's in a different in a different language. I did learn some French in college when I was as a kid, although I was terrible at it, so I don't remember most of it. I remember some of it. But it's nice to see. I have a fascination with languages and translation. I feel like I feel like even in a language that we both understand, you know, he's saying English, every story is a translation, right? Because when I create work, I am inadequately trying to translate what is in my mind onto paper. And then you read that work, but you don't know me. You don't know my mind at all. All you're reading is my inadequate translation. And you are then taking that and translating it with your unique experiences and your life into something that makes sense for you, right? But it's not just makes sense. It translates into something that is capable of being very powerful emotionally for the reader in ways that I intended, but only as a matter of translating from my own head onto the page. Yeah. So somewhere there is this translation that exists outside of the specificity of languages, a human translation happening of my experiences to a story, and then somebody using their unique set of experiences to translate that story to something that makes sense to them. And I think, therefore, all fiction exists in that translation, that human translation. So I'm always fascinated when my stories are turned into another language, and I still get people coming and saying, I really felt this. And in my brain, I'm always I'm like a child. So I go like, man, that's 3 layers of translation that something went through, but it created this human connection between 2 people who have never met. And I think that's why I think stories are powerful. Stories are amazing, magical things.
Yeah, I totally agree. That's what we learn in communication with those things, between the one who gives you idea, the one who receives it with his own experience. There's the noise in the middle, and all those things. It's fascinating. It's fascinating things.
Yeah, and I think it goes beyond communication. I mean, I know there's this very popular linguistic idea that, I mean, it's not an idea; it's a known theory, in that language does not exist as a medium of communication. Language exists as a medium of thought, and it is only in verbalizing or turning it into text that we make it a medium of communication. So everything that is ever written or spoken is a slightly paler version of something that is thought. I find that itself very fascinating. And then you do that twice, and then you do that in a foreign language. Blows my mind.
That's incredible. So we're going to talk about a book that was just released not long ago.
Yeah.
Swamp Thing.
Yeah.
Great book also. Already, so if I remember well, he's an Indian who goes to States for science.
Yeah.
So already a little thing in common.
Yeah. I try to put little bits and pieces of myself in all of my stories. I think that's the only way to write. Only way I know how to write them. So yeah.
How is it to come on a character like that who has a big history with incredible writers behind it, and you have to fill those big shoes? Is it a little kind of overwhelming, or is it just something like, okay, I do my thing? How do you live that?
No, I sought that book, so I don't think it's overwhelming. I think, to me, it's exciting. It's intimidating in some ways, but it's intimidating in all the good ways, in the ways that makes you want to go, I have to really do something cool with this, you know? And I'm the kind of person who gets very easily bored, in that if I'm doing something and I don't feel like the work itself is challenging me, then I get very bored with it. And this is true of both my creator-owned work and any work that I might be doing for other companies. So it's almost like I sought out Swamp Thing because I knew its history. I knew It was funny. One of the first people I mentioned it to was Kieran Gillen here in the UK. And as soon as I mentioned it, he was like, "Oh, you're doing Swamp Thing? You're a writer based out of the UK doing Swamp Thing? Like, there's a lot of history with that." And until he said it, I had just been like, "Yeah, whatever, man. I'm doing Swamp Thing." And then the moment he said it, I was like, "Oh shit, yeah, actually, I'm doing it." So thanks, Kieran. But yeah, I think that's the beautiful thing about stories, is that you're going to always, every story changes, every story evolves, mutates, it takes its own history and it grows because of it. But also other writers will come along and they will write stories in a way that reflects on that history in itself. Yeah. So rather than be overwhelmed by it or be overshadowed by it, I decided to engage with it. I knew the Moore run existed. I knew the Bernie Wright's and Len Wein stuff existed. I knew other writers like Snyder and Soule had great runs in that book. And when I came to it, I said, okay, cool. What am I going to do that is different from all of these things, but also engages with all of these things? And so if you look at the entire run, it engages with all of my favorite parts of other runs hopefully in interesting ways.
Oh yes, it is. I began it because I don't have it. I didn't have it for a long time, but I love. I've read, I think, the third 3 issues, plus the Future State. One of my favorite Future State stories. At first, the Future State story was supposed to be a longer run. I think you have said.
No, I don't think so. Okay. I think it was always meant to be a 2-part issue.
Okay.
No, I think the way it started out was originally that the Swamp Thing pitch was asked for 5G.
Okay,
which was going to be, but that was the pitch that is this series now. But then 5G didn't happen, and they came back and they said, "Hey, can we do a 2-part event story with Swamp Thing, and then we do this series?" I was like, okay, cool. Then we came up with the idea for Future State.
And I loved how you managed to, in 2 issues, it's a real story. It's a real story with a beginning, with an end. It feels complete. And I really love that.
Yeah, thank you. I wanted to kind of, I had the license to do whatever I wanted with that story. And they said, you could set it at the end of the world if you want to. And I said, okay, cool. I will set it at the end of the world. But more than that, I suppose somewhere down the line, it became, I will set at the end of Swamp Thing in a lot of ways. So it kind of became that, whatever happened to the Caped Crusader or whatever happened to the Man of Steel kind of concept, in that if we were to see the end of Swamp Thing, like, at least for me, what would it be? And yeah, I try to frame a story around that idea.
And tell me if I'm wrong, but I think it was supposed to be a shorter run, and it was expanded.
No, it was always pitched as a run of multiple seasons.
Okay.
So we said we're going to pitch for 10. Then by the time we're around 8 or 9, let's take a call if we want to keep it at 10, if we want to extend it. So I think by the time we were on issue 7 or 8, I think we had a conversation with DC, and they said, cool, let's keep it going. But let's keep it going for a shorter while so we can put together a good package once the run is done. We got 6 more issues. So I said, okay, I'm going to do 6 more issues, and I'm going to, end it at that point. And yeah, that's what I've been working towards. So hopefully, years from now, people will pick up a collected book that is all 16 issues and see that it is actually one continuing story.
Yeah, I say it once again, but it's true for each one of your books. The art, once again, this time by Mike Perkins, is absolutely beautiful. Great work from your artist. Was it an idea of your editor or yours?
Actually, it was kind of a different thing, in that Mike had already signed an exclusive contract with DC, and Mike was given the option of working whatever books or whatever books were in front of him at that point in time. And I know Mike had another Swamp Thing book that he could have chosen to work on with a much bigger writer as well. And for whatever reason, very kindly, Mike was like, no, this is the Swamp Thing that I will work on. And I think Mike's one of those sort of quintessential Swamp Thing artists, in that his Swamp Thing simultaneously feels so classic Swamp Thing, but is also clearly contemporary, 2022 comic book art, in terms of its storytelling aesthetics, all of those things.
Yeah, and I love how you concentrate on the change, on the change of the body, on the change of the identity. There's something of body horror, but at the same time very poetic. It's very complex to really point out. How did you approach the character for that book?
Yeah, I mean, I answered this question in a different interview. I don't know if that interview is out, but basically the question was, they were talking about Swamp Thing being Indian and the identity. It was the first time the character's able to switch back and forth between being human and being Swamp Thing. And I think all of that ties into what you said as well, which is that transition is something that we focus on each time. Very early on, when I pitched this book, I said, we need to move on from Alec Holland. And even within DC, people were like, oh, I'm not so sure, And I think it's because we're telling stories to readers who exist today in 2022. We're reading this book today in 2022. And yet we keep telling it from the perspective of a character who was clearly, if you read the definitive early, Wayne Wrightson Moore run, clearly a character of the 80s. And so I said, no, we need a character who represents today and now. And I think one of the big sort of contrasts in terms of the identity of the character between late 80s, early 90s and now is that I think the late 80s, early 90s was all about defining your character. You were American, or you were European, or you were Indian. And there was this kind of sense of like, this is where I come from. I think the modern international citizen in 2020, 2018, 2022 is someone who wields multiple identities at once, in that they transition back and forth between being French or Algerian, being a comic book lover, being a professional in whatever other field I'm sure you're working in. All of these things that are being juggled at a rate that we've never seen before, if you think about it, because we live in this world where I go to work from 9 to 5, then I call my parents back in India and I turn into an Indian. Then I do, I watch a Marvel superhero movie, which is all, American characters and Captain America, and somehow I seem to translate and get it. And I wanted to kind of bring that into the character, in that Levi, who is very much like me, an Indian immigrant who has lived in America long enough for him to have American relationships, but also wants to have a connection back home to being in India, wants to understand where he comes from. And so this kind of shifting back and forth between contrasting and conflicting identities is something we wanted to bring on a thematic level to the book. And so every time he transforms into Swamp Thing or Swamp Thing transforms back into him, there is either melancholy or there is conflict or there is purpose or there is anger, something, and is depicted through that visual conflict in that transformation, if you will.
And what you say, even for creators, I find it fascinating how you can work with, you're in UK, you can work with Indian artists, with Brian Hitch in the United States, with Felipe Andrade in Portugal.
I mean, I actually live in London, so I work across 3 time zones.
Yeah, that's it.
And somehow we produce a book that feels like it was one thing,
It's fantastic.
Yeah, and I think that really is the modern day identity. I think I said this somewhere and people may disagree, but I feel like we are nowhere people.
Yeah.
And therefore we are everywhere people. Like, I think the idea of national boundaries and cultural identities is fast being outpaced by the evolution of the modern day individual, if you will.
I understand. So we talk about a lot about your indie work a little, about your DC work. I have to talk about your Marvel work, of course. Mm-hmm. So you're on two big titles for Marvel.
Yeah.
Carnage and Venom.
Yeah.
I'll begin with Venom. How is it to? It's a little like playing piano at four hands. You're writing that book at two hands with Ali Wing.
Yeah. Yeah.
How is it to? It's the first time you do that kind of thing, I think.
Yeah, it is.
How
the
is
first
it for
time.
you?
I think it's an interesting process because even though it is co-writing, the way we came up with the story was genuinely two people, tossing ideas at each other until in the middle there's an amalgamation that has shape and structure, if you will. And I think to an extent the book feels that way, in that it does feel like two distinct narratives, but it feels like two narratives that are pushing and pulling and adding to each other and taking away from each other in some ways. So that's been an interesting experience. Al's brilliant writer to work with. I enjoy it thoroughly. It helps that he's also in the UK, so I get to sit down with him and have a chat whenever we need to. I think there's a long-term payoff, which we wouldn't have been able to plan if it wasn't for like a close relationship, if you will. I think the shape of the story that becomes clear at 10 issues is very different from the shape of the story that is clear at 20 or 30 issues.
We are 8, so it's very simple.
Yeah, excuse me. I'm having this.
Of course, no problem. No problem. Yeah, I love that Venom story. I was never big on Venom.
Yeah,
and I have to say, each issue, I have to go to the next one.
And I think we'll wait and see your reaction each time we expand the story into another conceptual place. Yeah, I mean, a lot of that comes down to craft, but I think the joy of it really is kind of pushing the character into places where I don't think with both books, with Venom or Carnage, I don't think the symbiotes have ever been in the kind of stories that they are in right now.
Even for Carnage, it's super interesting what you managed to do with that suspense about who is going to be the host of Carnage, with that kind of link he makes with each of the characters. It's super interesting. How did you? I know you often answer to the question, what characters would you want to write? You often answer, it's not about the character, it's about what story I have to tell with them.
Yeah.
How did you approach Carnage, for example?
Yeah, with Carnage, I think the challenge was to move away from Cletus Cassidy. And it wasn't necessarily something I pitched. I think it's just this kind of thing, like apparently I write all the monsters. And then because we successfully moved Swamp Thing away from Alec Holland, now everyone's like, okay, can you move Carnage away from Cletus Cassidy? I suppose we can. But then I found that very interesting in that Carnage as a symbiote, and I think this came up in one of the conversations with Al, was what if Cletus was the reason Carnage was holding back?
Yeah.
In that, what if Carnage the symbiote is actually
worse
than Cletus Cassidy in a lot of ways, and that took me to the idea of ambition, right? In that you can't get much worse than Cletus Cassidy in terms of, I like killing people and I enjoy it, yada, yada, yada. And that has always been part of Carnage. So how do you make a character like that worse? Well, they give them purpose. Right now it's wanton. Cletus has been killing people because he enjoys it. now all of a sudden Carnage is like, no, I will kill people with a greater purpose. And that's how real villains are born. When you let them do things that they enjoy, and when you let them tell themselves that they're doing it for a greater purpose.
And I love the way you manage the subvert the expectations things, where you use it, but you really build upon it. And it's really like in the Carnage book. I wasn't expecting, I won't say anything, but some of the interactions that happen, some of the links that are created in the book are like, what? Oh, okay. Where can you go? You want to know more about it. And it's super interesting to offer that kind of things, I think, in the book.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, with a book like Carnage, I think that's how you make it interesting, is you constantly subvert reader expectation. This is a character that has been around for quite some time, and through large parts of his publication history has done the same thing in multiple books. I don't want to write another book that's the same thing compared to the last 10 books, So my job then is to go at every point, no, this is not the book you think it is. So if you've read the first 3 issues, issue 4 is not going to be the book you expect it's going to be. 4, 5, 6 are going to be completely different. 7, 8, 9 are going to be completely different.
I can't wait. There are several books I want to talk about, so I'm going to have to go a little faster because we don't have much time. So, of course, I have to talk about it. As we can see behind you, there's that wall of covers of comics you wrote. How is it to know that you're going to be able to add to that Detective Comics, which is one of the most... Oh, it's already there? Okay. Yeah. One of the most emblematic comic books in American history, we can say, I think. How did it happen for you to be able to write on that book?
Well, I was finishing up my run on Swamp Thing. I knew I was ending my run on Swamp Thing. And I had already finished my run on Catwoman a while back. And my Catwoman editor and I were talking. She's like, hey, what do you want to do next? And I said, I kind of want to do something that I feel like I've worked on a lot of interesting projects that have been on a sort of less visible spotlight, and I've been able to do interesting things with them. Like, there hadn't been a Swamp Thing book in a really long time until there was this Swamp Thing. I think Catwoman was quite a popular character, even so, not quite the same as a Detective Comics or a Batman or something like that. And then I'd worked on Justice League Dark, which is, obviously its own popular thing, but certainly a set of characters that are on the left hand of the DC universe, if you will. And I had a blast doing that. But I think working on something that is very much front and center DC mainstream is the kind of challenge that I wanted to work on next. So I said, I want to do something that feels like it's on a bigger stage, bigger scope. And I talked to her and I said, there are 2 things I would like to do. One of those things I won't mention, but the second one, I said, I would like to work on either that, or I would like to work on Detective. And, we talked about it. And then a month later, through complete serendipity, I think, Jessica Chen, who was the editor I was talking to, she took over Detective from its previous editor, who was moving over to a different office. And so she was like, hey, remember that conversation we had a month ago? So I'm, editing Detective now. Do you want to come write Detective? And then things just kind of fell into place after that. So
that's fantastic.
Thank you, Jessica.
Yeah, I think a lot of Batman fans are very happy for what's coming. A lot of great things have been done on Batman and on Detective Comics, but that pair of Ramvi and Zdarsky for that character, I see around me a lot of people are really, really waiting for that.
Yeah, I'm glad. I've had the pleasure of looking at some of Chip's plans for the character. And
everything.
It's crazy. And then, I've been able to share what I'm doing with Chip as well. And there's always been this kind of either intertwining narratives or two different narratives in Batman and Detective. I think it's interesting that they're going to be different narratives that are also aesthetically doing different things. And I think that's very nice, because I always ask myself the question that I want readers to read both books. And so I ask my question, if I'm doing the same thing as the main Batman title, why do I expect the reader to read two books that are doing the same thing? And so it was part of my pitch that we needed Detective to be aesthetically and narratively doing something entirely different. So yeah, I'm quite excited for people to see it. I like the idea of a overly dramatic, operatic Batman. So,
and that's a word I want to talk about. So you often say that is going to be based on Gothic opera, but I think a lot of people nod, but don't really get what it can mean in reality.
Yeah, so, I mean, I think it's interesting because people always come to me and say, "Oh, so you're basing it off an opera, so it's going to be an opera?" And I'm like, "No, it's not going to be an opera. It's going to be a comic book." It's also going to be a very Batman comic book, you know. But I think those two words are very interesting in terms of what they mean aesthetically. So when someone says a Gothic aesthetic, it means it's going to be dark. It has this kind of oppressive melancholy sitting over everything. There are, important crossovers between noir and Gothic aesthetics, and there is a undercurrent of fear of darkness, of fear of old things that drives this kind of narrative of dread underneath it all. So that's what Gothic means to me. And when people say operatic, I think again is talking about the aesthetics rather than the specifics of what an opera is. In the aesthetics, I mean, it is always flourishing with its acting and high melodrama, and the dialogue is almost lyrical and poetic at all times. And the smallest of choices seem like the most dramatic things because you can hear the violins playing in the background. The best example of something like that is, to me, the Hannibal TV show. It felt to me very Gothic and very operatic. And so I kind of wanted to bring some of that aesthetic into the Batman comic in interesting ways. I think there are new villains. There are going to be new costumes. I think all the costume designs are tweaked a little bit to be more operatic. I'm loving writing it because I get to write some of the Batman characters in this kind of incredibly dramatic, melodramatic way almost. And so, yeah, I'm quite excited for people to see it. I agree with you. I don't think people quite know what to expect.
I think everyone is repeating that word, but everyone after is like, but what does it mean exactly, in fact?
Yeah. And I think people will see that. I think with issue 1, people will see it right away, why I use those two words. So yeah.
And you're talking about the villains in Batman, and I find it so interesting how each one of the authors, of the creators, are able to add their thing to each one of the villains each time. And so did you have, you can't spoil, but are there aspects of the villains that you really wanted to use in your book, something you can say?
Yeah, I think Two-Face is going to be an important part of the narrative. And I think Two-Face, especially given the current status quo, becomes a very interesting character to write, given what we're doing with it. And then there are new villains that I've introduced into the narrative. That there's always this kind of retroactive connection to the past when a new villain is introduced. Whereas the thing I wanted to do was have the new villain be someone who is literally the past. And so the idea of a golden age being used as a villain is quite interesting. So
I love it.
Especially considering, Gotham and Batman mirror each other as characters through most of the narrative. So
can't wait to read that. Just a very few more minutes, if you can.
Sure.
I want to talk about two of your books that normally are going to be released by iComics in France. Not now, but I hope soon.
Sure.
Blue and Green. I freaking love that book. It's incredible. I didn't know on what I was going when I began it, and it's just great. It's just fantastic. I wasn't expecting the horror element, and we have to talk about it because we can't make an interview without talking about your love for music. I think at some point, I know it's something very important if you're writing. Can you just explain a little what is Blue and Green for those who wouldn't know it?
Yeah, Blue and Green is a jazz-themed noir horror story that starts out as a detective story, but eventually becomes about the nature of greatness and the obsession of finding answers to greatness that drive creative people often into very dark places. That's how I would describe Blue and Green.
And once again, I have to talk about the art. It's just incredible. It's so good. It's so good. I heard already the story about how did you come to that style of art.
Yeah.
Because you yourself are an artist, we can say. I saw some of your drawings. It's quite good. I love how you explain how you're a big part of how the art is managed in your book. How did you work with your artist on that one?
On that one, I worked with Anand Radhakrishnan, who is a tremendously talented artist, but also just like a really humble, really nice person to work with, and someone who's interested in collaborating more than anything else. And I think we had already established a good working relationship based off of stuff that we'd done before, like Graffiti's Wall. And when we came to this, I think Anand and I were both in a place where we were like, we are absolutely happy to push each other to do interesting things. And while the first few pages were done, like a script that would go on, and then he would work on the art, eventually we realized that kind of the more interesting way to work on it was I would write a page, it would go to Anand, and then Anand would do the layouts and stuff for it, and then we would jam on that page at that point in time where things would change, and we'd say, okay, maybe we do this, maybe we add a panel here, and then he would create that page and it would come back, and I would look at that, and then I would write the next page. It was a long and tedious way to work on a book, but I think it leads to this kind of almost mesmeric effect in the book where it genuinely feels like one long improvisation rather than this kind of structured beginning, middle, and end kind of story. And I think that was invaluable eventually to the aesthetics of the story itself.
Yeah, and I found it very interesting in that book how you managed to. Okay, there's that musical thing going on, but it's also about sounds. You work a lot about around the sounds, and often we hear them. There's a lot of panels where you describe the sound elements, and it's very interesting how you manage to make us being part of that story and really hearing the things around them.
Yeah, I think good storytelling, at least I describe it this way, in a lot of ways, especially good descriptive storytelling, is about creating synesthesia, which is you have to experience, not literally, not by me telling you the texture of something, but by my choice of words, you must experience the texture of what I am describing. By their rhythm, you must experience the sound of what I'm describing. And so I think, to me as a writer, especially with prose, I think that's the most interesting aspect of it, is how words can influence your sensory response rather than your sort of comprehension response, if you will. And I think there's something fascinating there. I love using that in my work. I love reading books that do that successfully as well. So I'm glad it works.
It was perfectly fine. And so Blue and Green, soon in France. Really, you have to check that book for those listening. And the other one is also very linked to music. It's Radio Apocalypse.
Yeah.
So can you talk a little about that book? So a post-apocalyptic world.
Post-apocalyptic world where the story centers around the lives of the people who run the last functioning radio station on the planet. It's actually the first book that Anand and I talked about collaborating on. So oddly, it existed in our minds long before Graffiti's Wall or Blue and Green did. And then we talked about doing it at Vault, and the pandemic happened. And I don't know if you noticed, but one of the earliest responses were people were stepping out into their balconies and singing when there was lockdown. And I think that's where the story comes from, is that sort of, as human beings, we have a need, not necessarily to communicate, but to express, to broadcast through music. And I think there's something fascinating about a radio station just broadcasting into the unknown, at the end of the world, where clearly music is not the most important thing when everyone is trying to survive. And yet it is by far the most important thing when everyone is trying to survive. So, I kind of wanted to originally the idea was to do 4 different short stories set around that radio station. But then eventually they started to have connectivity, and there's a narrative line that wove through it all. And obviously, given my obsessive brain, I wanted to base every issue off of a song. So the first one was based off of Springsteen's I'm on Fire. The second one was based off of Beatles' J Tripper. And then the third one is going to be based off of Blue Oyster Cult, Don't Fear the Reaper.
Oh, right.
And the fourth one is based off of Bowie's Space Oddity. So Also, you have to realize that the first time this idea came to me, it came to me because I asked myself, if the world were to end 1 week from now, what would I put on a tape that I could listen to? So these were all songs that I would have included on that tape. So
good choice, really good choice. Talking about music, I have to talk about it because I heard you reference Alex Menard. I love his work, and I was wondering, what's your favorite project outside of Tool? Not to make it too easy. What's your favorite project of him?
Of Maynard?
Yeah.
Perfect Circle is pretty good.
Of course.
But I don't know that I think in terms of favorites. I know I keep referencing Tool all the time, but if you said, is Tool your favorite band? I don't know. I don't think in terms of favorites.
It's a fascinating band, I have to say.
It is, and it's very much the kind of nerdy music that I love. But, on an equal level, I love Sonny Rollins and Art Blakey and
Mike Patton, maybe?
Jazz. Sorry?
Mike Patton, you also?
I don't know. I haven't heard Mike Patton. But, I just love lots of different kinds of music. I love black metal. I love jazz. I love pop. I grew up learning a lot of different kinds of music. So I learned South Indian Carnatic music as a vocalist. I learned to play percussion instruments, the tabla, as a kid.
Okay. And you collect guitars, I think.
Yeah, I learned to play veena as well in India as a kid, which is another string instrument. Then when I was a teenager, I started playing started playing guitar. That kind of stuck. Started off playing classic rock on guitar. Eventually decided I was going to be a blues player. And so I started really getting into blues. So yeah, I've just been kind of my musical taste. I always find it difficult to answer questions like, what's your favorite film or what's your favorite book? You know,
I can totally get that. I started playing classical. Same, I was in school, but every afternoon it was a special thing. I was in a conservatoire. It's an official music school, playing saxophone and alto. And I worked in music. I finished being a DJ. Working in a rock club, then in an electronic club, then so I totally get I love all kind of music. It's really the same. I have a really hard time saying that more than that, or
so like basically to come back to your original question, you know, I've heard everything Maynard has been a part of, including Green Jelly. So
I know that one.
Oh yeah, so he was part of a band called Green Jelly, and they did a relatively famous song called Big Bad Wolf or Little Pig, something like that. It's a silly band, but it was great.
Okay.
But yeah, I've enjoyed all of his work, largely because it kind of tickles that nerdy prog rock music as rhythm, music as cycle, music as mathematics in a lot of ways. It tickles that part of my brain, so I love it.
Okay, I don't want to take too much of your time. So there's another book. I hope we will be able to talk about another time when it's really released in France. It's Aquaman, because man, it's just incredible. So we can keep it for another time, but really for people, check that one if you can, because Aquaman the Becoming with Andromeda, pardon. Aquaman Andromeda.
Yeah.
Andromeda with Christian Ward. A fantastic book. Abyss meets Aquaman. It's incredible. The atmosphere, the story, the way you handle the existence of Aquaman being that kind of myth is just great. I love that book.
Glad. Yeah, it's great to see the response. I think people are enjoying it. I think it's not what people expected from an Aquaman book. But then that's the joy of making something at Black Label, is you get to do unexpected things, which is nice.
It will be 3 issues. That's it?
Yeah. 3 issues, but they're all oversized 48-page issues. And yeah, you know, Christian and I are working on the 3rd one right now.
Fantastic. Man, I think I took enough of your time, so I really want to say thank you for coming here. It was a real pleasure. You're my first creator guest, and it's a real pleasure that it's you, really. So thanks again. Thanks to Chiara, your agent, because of who it was possible to make it happen. So really, thanks to you both.
Thank you.
And I hope you'll be fine very well, very soon.
Yeah,
you feel better.
Yeah, it's just a lingering cough. Hopefully, it'll be gone in a couple of days.
Great. So thanks, man. I let you return to your work or your family life.
Thanks.
And thanks a lot. And really, it was a pleasure.
Yeah, my pleasure to be here.
Goodbye.
Have a nice one.
Thanks.